I'm a writer, I'm a journalist by background. I worked at the Times newspaper. I now am an ambassador for SANE, for Rethink and Young Minds. I was a reporter. I was working at the Times newspaper and I was in the newsroom. And my husband was working at Goldman Sachs. So we had exciting, good jobs that we'd worked very hard to get and we loved. But having said that, I was quite anxious. I'd always been quite anxious, and it was definitely a stressful job. No way working in a newsroom is not a stressful job. And we also had 2 small children. And what happened was, one night, I couldn't get to sleep. I'd had bits of insomnia before, but this insomnia was rather different. So with this insomnia came some quite alarming physical symptoms. My heart rate speeded up. I remember feeling very sick, like I had to throw up. And my mind was racing, and my thoughts went something like this. Well, if I don't get to sleep, I can't get to work. If I can't get to work, can't pay the bills. I can't pay the bills, lose the house. Can't pay the mortgage, all over. Lose the children, all over. I later learned that this kind of thinking is called catastrophic. You go from sort of hero to zero about 1 second flat, and your whole life kind of unravels before you. And in addition, my mind was going round and round and round. Again, I later learned this is called rumination. It's when you can't kind of grip your mind. And I remember feeling it was a bit like a skater, and the marks on the ice were just sort of getting deeper and darker and deeper and darker. And I remember also having a very alarming sensation that I was falling. I remember sort of gripping the bed, feeling like I was falling. Anyway, the night wore on and I felt really iller and iller and iller and more frightened because I didn't know what was going on. But supposedly being this kind of high-functioning together kind of person, the next morning I thought, right, crack on, pull myself together, as we just heard, refasten activity to its normal timetable, breakfast at breakfast time, lunch at lunchtime, dine at dinner time, and I'll sleep at night time and I'll be back to my normal, busy, functioning self. Unfortunately, this didn't happen. These symptoms were getting worse and worse and worse. The heart racing was just getting really, really very bad. Stayed up the next night. Kept on going. Stayed up the next night. And on the 3rd night, I felt so ill that I found myself, my husband took me to hospital. Actually, initially to a GP, but then straight to hospital. And when I got to the hospital, I said, I must be about to see a cardiologist because this racing heart, I think I'm having a heart attack. I felt so unwell. And the doctor sat me down. He said, no. He said, you're not having a heart attack. He said, you are showing the classic signs of an anxiety-driven major depressive episode. So, quick sort of biology lesson. It's the fear, fright or flight response gone into kind of chronic overdrive. So you want to throw up because you've got to empty your stomach to run faster. Your mind's racing because, back in the day you'd have seen a lion across the savannah and you're in total fear. And so you're trying to grip the situation. All the symptoms I was showing were this anxiety-driven type of depression. Depression can present in different ways, but that's my type. I'm actually quite jolly and cheerful, but I do get anxious. Anyway, and it had morphed into major depression. Something had gone wrong with my brain, in fact. Anyway, I was very ill, and I went to hospital, and I was treated mainly with drugs, which is the main treatment of depression on the NHS. Still, it's a medication-based approach to mental health. A little bit of cognitive behavioural therapy, if you're lucky, in addition. But that was what happened to me. Took lots of drugs. I took the drugs that calm you down. You probably know there are different kinds of antidepressants. There's ones that calm you down. That's my type. There's things like Prozac, which cheer you up. Some people present depression with a kind of lassitude and low mood, but that's not my way. Anyway, I went to hospital. I got better, and I went back to work after about 6 months. And when I got back to work, I shut the book down completely. That was 1997. We are 2017, and we just saw in the room today that a good proportion of you felt that they would find it hard to talk about mental illness. So you can imagine in 97, I didn't want to talk about it at all. People talk about self-stigma. And I definitely had that in spades. So I went back to work and I changed absolutely nothing. I thought, great, this nasty thing, it's just a one-off, it's going to go away. Unfortunately not. I then had a second major depressive episode a few years later. This is incredibly common. The breaking leg analogy in some ways is useful in the sense that if you've broken your leg once, you're likely to break your leg again. If you've had one major depressive episode, you're likely to have a second. So that second episode happened around 10 years ago, and I was very, very ill again, and this time I was ill for 2 years, more or less. It's all a little bit, it's not quite so simple because actually your recovery is kind of much more mixed. But when I say I was ill for 2 years, by that I mean I wasn't functioning, and the way I judged at that time that I wasn't functioning was that I didn't do a single school pickup. I don't know why, suddenly felt a bit emotional. Many of you here may be parents. Quick show of hands, how many of you are parents? Lots of you are parents. You'll all know how much you like to pick up your children from school. And I didn't pick up our children from school for 2 years. And actually, my son was given a prize for bribery. Bravery, because I hadn't showed up for 2 years. Anyway, that was about, as I say, that ended about 5-6 years ago, the very serious episode. And it was at that point that I decided to try and discover much more about what were the good evidence-based strategies for good mental health and for a very much more holistic approach, because drugs can be absolutely essential, but obviously they're prescribed by a psychiatrist. But what were the other strategies that I could do to look after my mental health? Because I think I'd got to the point of understanding that mental illness is exactly that. You know, something goes wrong with our brain. Something definitely went wrong with my brain. But, like all illnesses, it happens in a context. And why shouldn't it? And I suppose I want to end, as I say, on a note of optimism. I do believe there's a huge amount that we can do. Prevention's better than cure. We can put some of these well-being strategies into place long before employees have a problem. So thank you very much.